Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. So hello everyone and welcome to Basics Discussion Circle and Meditation. My name is Travis, I facilitate this group. So yeah, I think tonight we'll just kind of head straight into the meditation and see where things go. So closing the eyes and taking 3 deep breaths slowly. Noticing if deep breathing feels good for the body. If it does, you can keep on breathing in this way. If it doesn't, you can switch things up. Try even deeper breathing still or more shallow, heavier or lighter. In long and out short, or in short and out long. Just noticing what the body needs in this moment. If this seems too involved, you can just pose the question in the mind as to what kind of breathing would feel the most soothing or energizing for the body in this moment. And then just watch how the breath responds. Once you've found a comfortable rhythm and texture of breath, you can allow yourself, your awareness, to sink into it, to settle into it, just allowing that rhythm to continue. Breathing in, settling into the body. Breathing out, relaxing into the present moment. And as you maintain this awareness of the breath, you can begin to notice if you're holding any tension in your forehead or around your eyes. With the forehead and the eyes relaxed, you can move on down to the shoulders. See if you can allow the shoulders to drop. And then keep them relaxed all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out-breath. With the forehead and the shoulders relaxed, you can notice if there's any tension or struggle involved with the breathing process itself. When you're breathing in, is there a sense that you're forcing the air in? When you're breathing out, is there a sense that you're squeezing the air out? See if you can soften this process, where you're allowing the air to flow in and allowing the air to flow out. Open and spacious. Now that we've taken some time to settle in with the breath, we can begin some spinal breathing or some tracing of the spinal column. So we can, as we're breathing in, we can allow our awareness to travel down the spinal column, relaxing tension. And as we breathe out, we can allow our awareness to travel back up the spinal column from the tailbone to the tip of the head, lengthening the spine. Breathing in, awareness flows from the tip of the head to the base of the spine, soothing the back, soothing the spine. Breathing out, breath awareness flows up the spine to the tip of the head, lengthening the spine. As we continue the spinal breathing, we can begin to place a little more emphasis on the in-between breath, the space between each in and out and in breath. As you're breathing in, drawing breath and awareness down the spine, soothing the spine. And when you get to the end of the in-breath, you can imagine that breath and awareness radiating out from the tailbone in all directions, And as you breathe out, you can allow awareness and breath to climb back up the spine to the crown of the head. And on that in-between breath, you can imagine this breath awareness radiating out from the head. Soothing any tension. Breathing in, drawing breath awareness from the crown down to the tailbone. In between breath, radiating out from the tailbone. Breathing out, drawing breath awareness up the spine to the tip of the head. In between breath, radiating out from the head. That's it. And once again, taking 3 deep breaths slowly. Just opening the eyes bit by bit with each breath, never in a rush to leave the meditation. So as always, if anyone would like to share how that experience of meditation was for them, I'd love to hear it. If anyone has any questions or comments about Buddhist practice in general, I'd love to hear it. What we did today, or this meditation that we just did, I would call it spinal breathing, but really it's just breath meditation. It's just applying the breath meditation, all the same skills that we use to go through the entire body to something more specific. There's all sorts of ways of perceiving the breath and working with the breath, and a large part of the practice of meditation is learning what ways of working with and perceiving the breath work best for you. That's why I'll often do different things, or either we go through the body, or we try to imagine expanding out beyond the body, or we just trace the spine. We imagine we're a vase and we're filling ourselves with breath, all sorts of different things, just to see what kind of perception helps to settle individual minds. Yeah. The general purpose of doing this particular style of breath meditation, at least the way that I'm approaching it, is to become a little more aware of that in-between breath. Because there's all sorts of types of breath, and breath energy throughout the body, breath sensation throughout the body. Where the in-breath typically for most people feels like a rising or an expanding. And the out-breath feels like a falling or a contracting. I'd say probably for most people it feels like rising and falling, because you'll feel the stomach or the chest rise and fall as you breathe. And then you have this in-between breath, which is, I think, really interesting, because it's with the in-breath and the out-breath, there's movement. There's movement causing the breath sensation. With the in-between breath, the breath sensation is caused by an absence of movement or a ceasing of movement. The image that comes to mind for me is, I don't know if you've ever seen where people will have water in a glass jar, and then they'll squirt dye into the water, and the dye will flow down just like the in-breath. It'll flow down, and then when it in kind of a straight line-ish, and then when it hits the bottom, it will expand out into like a cloud. And that's kind of how it feels working with these 3 types of breathing. When you breathe in, And there's that sense of that rising. If you're focusing on the stomach or chest, the in-breath would be a sense of rising. If you're focusing on the back of the throat, the in-breath would be a sense of falling. It just depends on where you're focused. But so you have this breath, the breath going in one direction, and then when the breath stops to change directions, there's actually a lot going on in that little moment when it stops. But we place most of our focus or all of our focus on in and out. But there's a lot of other things going on in between. There's in-breath, there's out-breath, there's in-between breath. There's the breath that's going on in the background of all of this. A really kind of still breath or a still field of sensation throughout the body that's not really dependent on movement or is a layer beneath movement. And maybe I'm getting a little abstract here, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure if you're following, because it can be a little strange. But one of the interesting things, or the most interesting thing to me about the in-between breath and focusing on that is, one, we're now aware of like a third of the breathing process that we're doing that we weren't aware of before. So it's a more all-around awareness. We're more able to notice things as they arise because our awareness is more complete. We're not lapsing into unawareness between each breath. The other interesting thing is that the in-between breath is the breath of the more blatant breaths. It's the one closest to that kind of still breath, that still field of energy or field of awareness that's kind of always throughout the entire body. So what's really cool is you can kind of use that in-between breath as a gateway to tap into that even stiller breath. Because the in-between breath has a little bit of movement. It has movement that's caused by movement stopping. It's just like the image I gave where you drop the dye into the water, hits the base of the jar, and then it expands. So there's a bit of movement there, but it's a lot less movement. One thing that we would do with that meditation, if it went longer, but I felt like it went long enough, is to then transition from being aware of the in, the between, and the out to just focusing on the in-between and the in-between. So, yeah. And as you focus on the two in-between breaths and kind of don't pay that much attention to the in and out, you start to kind of tune into a deeper level of breath. A level of breath that's less about movement and more just about general sensation. Yeah. And it's that kind of, it's resting in that place of still sensation where we can become a lot less reactive if we can make that our baseline. Sherry shared, I focused on releasing the tension from my head because it has felt full since I had my second COVID shot this week. It helped. I have trouble sensing the in-between breath unless I pause, though. Yeah, that's one of the challenges. I'm glad that releasing the tension helped. That is one of the challenges with beginning to focus on the in-between breath. Is there can be a bit of a drive, a bit of an inclination to want to hold the breath in between. I don't really recommend holding the breath in between. It's more a matter of just with consistency, like anything else, with consistency and practice, you can begin to notice the subtleties of the in-between breath. And it's a sense of movement in one direction. And then the second that movement stops, there's almost like it opens up. There's the sense of opening. And then the movement begins again. So it's almost like one of the images that would come to mind is it's almost like you have this ball here, and then the ball becomes a tube. And then the tube expands back into a ball again. becomes a tube, goes up, expands back into a ball again. That's kind of how it feels. So it can be hard to notice it as a separate sensation because in many senses it's really a continuing of that movement. It's just instead of that movement being kind of constricted, it expands out. So yeah. The reason I don't recommend holding the breath, aside from obvious, we need oxygen, but it's also that by holding the breath, we're not really focusing on the in-between breath. We're focusing on holding the breath. And it's a totally different sensation. So the in-between breath is a really subtle sensation, but it can be really beneficial. It can feel really healing, really soothing. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything they would like to share? Or any questions or anything like that? So I had one thing in mind that I wanted to potentially touch on. And it's something I've kind of been playing around with in my head for a little while, of including a bit more of like this is a chanting book, and chanting is probably in terms of formal practice, not like, helping other people and being of service, but in terms of like formal Buddhist practice, if you want to call it that, it's my main practice. Even more so than meditation. I found that chanting, it's definitely not for everyone. But I found for myself that chanting is really centering for the mind. It's something that I do before I do my formal seated meditation. Is I do about half an hour to 45 minutes of chanting. And it's just something that I found personally that really centers the mind, really gets the mind in gear. And it kind of flavors the thoughts that I have during the meditation. So instead of, like if I'm meditating first thing in the morning, instead of going into the meditation with whatever weird dreams I had in my head, or nightmares or whatever it might be, or that thing I got pissed off about the night before or whatever. If I go into the meditation straight from there, it's a bit of a mess and I spend the majority of the meditation kind of straightening things out. But if I start with chanting, with a bit of chanting, again, like half an hour to 45 minutes, then my thoughts, if my mind wanders, which of course it will, it tends to more often than it would otherwise wander to more skillful thoughts or wander to the chant, wander to a thought of the chant being recited, and then the chant kind of pushes me right back into the breath. So chanting is a big part of my practice. I really enjoy it. I haven't been able to figure out a way to really incorporate it in class, like group chanting, because you would need a copy of the chanting book and pronunciation's kind of hard and stuff like that. But I do want to share a verse here, and this is one of the verses that I read every morning. So I'll just kind of read it, and then if there's questions or if I think of something to say on it, that's how we'll do that. Normally this is said in like a rhythmic sense, but I won't put you all through that. So, the way this chanting book works is it says it first in Pali, which is like ancient Indian, and then it repeats it in English. And I really like that because some places they'll just chant in a foreign language that I don't understand, or they'll just chant in English. And when it's just chanted in English, it's also pretty strange. So it's nice to balance with both of them. So, Mayantam Dhammam Sutve Evam Janama. Having heard the Dhamma, or Dharma, we know this. Jati pi dukkha, jarat pi dukkam, maranam pi dukkam. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha. Sukha parideva dukkha, domana upayasa pi dukkha. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are dukkha. Apyehi sampiyogo, dukopyehi vipyogo, dukoyam pi icham lalabhati tampi rukam. Association with things disliked is dukkha. Separation from things liked is dukkha. Not getting what one wants is dukkha. Sakhe tena pakuparana kanda dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. So that's the first part of it. And for anyone not aware, dukkha is a Pali word. It literally means like a faulty wheel axle or a faulty wheel bearing. So it can mean anything from a small sense of dissatisfaction to life-crushing suffering. Dukkha is what's normally translated as suffering, or sometimes dissatisfaction, stress, things like that. I prefer to leave it as dukkha because it's such a perfect term. The way, like if a wheel bearing is too tight for the axle, the ride will be really uncomfortable or impossible. If it's slightly off center, the ride's going to be all over the place. The wheel's going to be all over the place. If the wheel bearing is too big, the wheel will just fall right off. So I really like that kind of image of it being that flexible. So this is actually the first teaching that the Buddha ever gave, and I chant it every morning because it's the first teaching he ever gave. And it's basically the core of his teachings. And then he basically just expanded on this one teaching and built upon it. And built the entire practice around it. So it's important to, at least to me, it's important to know this one, to know this sutra. And then for those of you wondering what the 5 clinging aggregates are, so you're in Sakhe tena paku pada nakanda dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. So the 5 clinging aggregates, and this is something I haven't necessarily touched on in the past either, is the clinging aspect. But the 5 aggregates are basically a collection of experiences, I guess you would say, that make up us as a conscious being, right? So this verse follows up with Sayatidam, namely Rupu Padanakando, the form clinging aggregate. So form meaning that we have a body, we have senses with which to perceive things. Vedanu Padanakando, the sensation clinging aggregate, meaning the sensations, the input that we have come in, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. So because we have a body, sensations arise. The sensations that arise are either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Sanyupadanakando, the perception clinging aggregate. So we have sensations arise. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Then perception arises. I like, I dislike, I'm uncertain in response to pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Or I like, I dislike, I don't care. When things are neutral, people tend not to care too much. But if you can learn to enjoy the neutral, it's a pretty good place to be. Sankharu Padanakando, the fabrication clinging aggregate. And Sankharu here, or fabrication, can also be mental formation, and it's more of what we would think of as an emotion or a kind of a storyline. So from our perception of I like it, I don't like it, I don't care, then arises the mental formation or the fabrication of here's my whole life story about why I like, dislike, or don't care about this particular thing that happened. And here's my whole, I had a sensation arise, that sensation gave rise to a preference. Now I feel, from fabrication, I feel like I have to validate my preference. I have to explain my preference to myself. So that's kind of fabrication or mental formation. Unayanu para nakando, the consciousness clinging aggregate. Consciousness being what is aware of all of these aggregates and what kind of ties these aggregates together. The interesting part is it's not the 5 aggregates that are stressful, it's the 5 clinging aggregates. So the aggregates in and of themselves are form, our feel, or form, our sensation, our perceptions, our fabrications, our consciousness. They're not inherently stressful. What's inherently stressful is when we're clinging to them. And it's that very clinging that's stressful. These aggregates, when they're devoid of clinging, are actually part of the path to liberation. Being able to see into them and make use of them. And then this verse, it's almost over, I promise. This verse continues on to Evam bagacha panasa bhagavato sawakesu anusasami bahulam pawatati. Many times did the Buddha emphasize this part of his admonition. Rupam anicca, form is inconstant. Vedana anicca, sensations are inconstant. Sanya anicca, perceptions are inconstant. Sanghara anicca, fabrications are inconstant. Vinayanam anicca, consciousness is inconstant. Rupam anatta, form is not self. Vedana anatta, sensations are not self. Sanya anatta, perceptions are not self. Sangharu anatta, fabrications are not self. Vinayanam anatta, consciousness is not self. Sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe dhamma anattati. All fabrications are inconstant. All phenomena is not self. So that's how that verse ends. So one thing there, the part of the verses where it's talking about how each of them independently is not self and is inconstant and not self. And it's already covered that they're stressful because we cling to them. These are like the 3 characteristics or the 3 perceptions. They're really important in Buddhism. Stressful or dukkha, impermanent, and not self. But the part of that I find really interesting, because you often hear about no self, but the part of that I find really interesting with this, and it's, it's as about as direct of a quote from the Buddha as you can get with, just like 2,500 years passed by. But nowhere in any of this first teaching that he gave, does he say there's no self. He doesn't say that anywhere. He just lists these components of existence, form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness as being not self, anatta. And then he even follows up with sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe dhamma anattati. All fabrications are inconstant, meaning everything that we fashion out of the mind is inconstant. And all phenomena is not self. And that's really interesting. It's not saying there's no self, it's saying that basically all observable phenomena is not self. So there's not necessarily a no self thing. And I think people will often struggle with that. Like, so many questions come up when people hear no self, like, well, if there's no self, what gets reborn? And if there's no self, what this, what that? And people really get caught up on that no self. But the Buddha never said there was no self. He used the word anatta. So atta is a sense of self, a sense of being. And then anatta is basically when in Pali, when you put an A in front of something, it's the same as if you put a UN in front of English. So you've got happiness, unhappiness. You've got natta or anatta, self, not self. Unhappiness, the word unhappiness doesn't state that there's no such thing as happiness. And in the same way, like healthy and unhealthy, unhealthy doesn't state that that person has no form of health at all. So it's just an interesting thing to note, to not get caught up on that sense of, is there a self, isn't there a self? It's one of the questions the Buddha never really answered. When he was asked those kind of questions, he answered that in a sense that in some places, a sense of identity, a sense of self can be beneficial towards the practice. And in some places, a sense of self, a sense of identity is non-beneficial to the practice. And it's really a matter of discernment and being able to learn when applying and identifying with something can be skillful, and when identifying with something just leads to more suffering. And that's basically what the teaching on non-self or not self is. It's not it's not this like super metaphysical doctrine of like we don't exist. It's more referring to sometimes it's useful to have a perception of self, and sometimes it's detrimental to have a perception of self. Because if we get really caught up in I-making and my-making and keeping alive a certain perception that we have of who we are, a lot of suffering can go into that when we start to get a cognitive dissonance, meaning when the version of ourselves that we've built up in our head clashes with what our experience of reality is showing us about ourselves. So that's kind of what the no self, non-self, not no self, non-self or not self refers to. It's referring to when a perception of self is not beneficial, when we're putting all this energy into creating in our heads this ideal version of ourselves and presenting to others this ideal version of ourselves. So much energy is wasted on that could be put towards finding a source of happiness within, put towards finding ways to truly benefit ourselves instead of trying to live like a Facebook post life. We present the best version of ourselves, or many of us do, through our Facebook posts. I don't really post, but back when I did, that was the intention. Looking back on the memories that come up, it definitely wasn't what came across as being the ideal version of myself. But that's kind of what we do. We do it on social medias where it's the most apparent, where we're like, we might see one of our friends and we're like, you're not like that. You're really like this. What are you doing? But we do that all the time. We just don't notice when we're the one doing it. We notice when other people do it. So it's really helpful, this doctrine of non-self, to be able to realize all of that's just some play and fantasy. It's not really whatever perception or opinion we have of ourselves isn't really the objective truth. It's just a version of ourselves that we've curated and designed because we think it will make us happy. When in reality, a fixed image of ourselves is one of the things that contributes most to our suffering. Yeah. So with that, we are at time. But yeah. So if comfortable, please join palms. We'll do a dedication of merit. May any merit gained from tonight's meditation and discussion be dedicated to Marisa's father in his time of transition, and to Marisa and her family who suffer at this time. May all beings in all directions, without limit or end, be healthy, joyful, and at ease. May we all be healthy, joyful, and at ease. Metta karuna mudita upeka sahanga teya chetasa chaturisam bharatva viharati samabudaro bhavena samanamaru bhavena samasangharo bhavena sote hantu nirantarang. Good night, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. I'll see you next week.